The heavy bag exploded backward with a thunderous crack that silenced every conversation in Iron Forge boxing gym. Marcus "Tank" Sullivan, all 240 pounds of him, stood frozen in disbelief as the woman who barely reached his shoulders stepped back and calmly adjusted her simple black workout gloves. The bag, reinforced with steel chains and built to withstand punishment from heavyweight champions, swayed violently from a single punch that had lasted exactly 3 seconds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sound echoed off the exposed brick walls like a gunshot, and in that moment, every eye in the gym turned to witness what would become the most talked about 3 seconds in Portland's underground fighting scene. Tank's cocky grin melted away as he stared at the woman he'd been mocking for the past 20 minutes, the woman he'd dismissed as just another suburban mom playing pretend warrior. Her name was Riley Carpenter, and she looked like someone you'd pass in the grocery store checkout line without a second thought. At 42, she carried herself with quiet confidence, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing faded black leggings and a plain gray tank top that had seen better days. There was nothing flashy about her appearance, nothing that screamed fighter or warrior. She drove a 2018 Honda Civic, worked as a part-time bookkeeper for a small accounting firm, and lived alone in a modest duplex 15 minutes from the gym. But if you looked closer, really looked, you might notice the way she moved with precise economy, never wasting a step or gesture. You might catch the slight calluses on her knuckles, faded now but still visible. You might see how her hazel eyes tracked movement in her peripheral vision, cataloging threats and exits with unconscious precision. Around her neck, barely visible beneath her shirt collar, hung a simple silver chain with a small cross pendant, polished smooth from years of unconscious touching. Riley had walked into Iron Forge boxing gym on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, when the Portland rain drummed steadily against the industrial windows and the air inside hung thick with the scent of leather, sweat, and determination. The gym occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse in the Buckman neighborhood, its concrete floors stained with decades of blood, sweat, and dreams. Vintage fight posters covered the brick walls, featuring legends like Ali Frazier and Hagler, their faces watching over the daily grind of aspiring fighters. She'd approached the front desk where Coach Vincent Rodriguez, a former middleweight contender with a gray goatee and hands like gnarled oak, was reviewing training schedules. Vincent had built Iron Forge from nothing 23 years ago, transforming it into one of the most respected boxing gyms on the West Coast. His philosophy was old school. Respect was earned through sweat and skill, not bought with expensive gear or fancy memberships. "I'd like to sign up for some training sessions," Riley had said, her voice soft but clear. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her, looking around at the sparring rings and heavy bags with genuine appreciation rather than intimidation. Vincent looked up from his clipboard, taking in her appearance with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen every type of wannabe fighter walk through his doors. Soccer moms looking for a workout trend, business executives trying to relieve stress, college kids wanting to look tough at parties. He developed a sixth sense for separating serious students from fitness tourists. "You ever boxed before?" he asked, not unkindly but with the directness that defined everything about Iron Forge. "A little," Riley replied, which was technically true in the way that saying the Pacific Ocean contained a little water was technically accurate. "I'm looking to get back into shape, maybe learn some self-defense." Vincent nodded, making a note on his intake form. The gym membership was straightforward. $60 a month for access, additional fees for personal training or specialized classes. Riley paid in cash, filled out the basic paperwork with neat handwriting, and requested access to the open training hours rather than the structured fitness classes that attracted most casual members. Open gym can get intense, Vincent warned, studying her carefully. We've got serious fighters training for professional bouts. It's not exactly a gentle environment. Riley smiled, and for just a moment, something flickered in her eyes that made Vincent pause. I understand. I prefer to train quietly. That was 3 weeks ago, and Riley had become a regular fixture during the late afternoon sessions when the serious fighters prepared for upcoming matches. She arrived promptly at 4:30 each Tuesday and Thursday, changed in the small women's locker room, and spent exactly 90 minutes working through what appeared to be basic conditioning routines. She used the lighter heavy bags, practiced simple combinations, and worked on footwork drills that seemed elementary to the experienced fighters around her. The other gym members quickly categorized her as harmless. Tommy Walsh, a 24-year-old welterweight with Olympic aspirations, often made jokes about the suburban mom who was probably training to survive her book club meetings. Bryce Patterson, a former MMA champion who now trained amateur fighters, occasionally offered condescending advice about her stance or punch technique, speaking slowly as if explaining calculus to a kindergartner. But it was Marcus "Tank" Sullivan who had elevated the mockery to an art form. Tank was the gym's heavyweight star, an undefeated professional boxer with 17 wins and 13 knockouts. At 28, he possessed devastating power and the kind of natural charisma that made sponsors pay attention. His training sessions drew crowds of amateur fighters who hoped to absorb some of his success through proximity. Tank stood 6'4" and moved with the fluid grace of someone who had never doubted his physical dominance. His black hair was always perfectly styled. His training gear bore logos from major athletic sponsors, and his social media presence showcased a lifestyle of luxury cars, expensive restaurants, and celebrity appearances. He was scheduled to fight for a regional title in 6 weeks, and everyone at Iron Forge knew this was his stepping stone to national recognition. Riley's quiet presence had initially escaped Tank's notice entirely. She trained during his sessions but kept to the periphery, using equipment he never bothered with, staying invisible in the way that people become when they pose no threat to your ego or territory. But as days turned to weeks, her consistent presence began to irritate him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Maybe it was how she never watched him train, never seemed impressed by his power or technique. Maybe it was how Vincent treated her with the same respectful professionalism he showed to paying members, regardless of her obvious amateur status. Or maybe it was simply that Tank had built his identity around being the undisputed alpha in any room he entered. And even the presence of someone who didn't acknowledge that dominance felt like a challenge. The breaking point came on this particular Tuesday when Tank was working through his heavy bag routine, throwing combinations that shook the entire gym setup. Each punch landed with bone-jarring force, the sound echoing through the cavernous space like thunder. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A small crowd had gathered to watch, as always happened when Tank trained, their faces showing the mixture of awe and fear that his power inspired. Riley was at the far end of the gym, working through what appeared to be basic shadowboxing combinations. Her movements were precise but restrained, like someone carefully going through physical therapy exercises rather than preparing for combat. She wore no protective gear except simple black training gloves, and her routine seemed almost meditative in its quiet intensity. "Hey lady," Tank called out, his voice carrying easily across the gym. The crowd around him chuckled, anticipating entertainment. "You're gonna hurt yourself throwing punches like that." Riley paused in her routine, turning to acknowledge him with polite attention. "I'm sorry?" "Your form," Tank said, stepping away from his heavy bag and walking toward her with the swagger of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. "You're dropping your guard after every combination. In a real fight, you'd be unconscious in 10 seconds. The gym had grown quiet, other training sessions pausing as people sensed developing drama. Vincent looked up from the ring where he'd been working with a young amateur, his expression neutral but watchful. "I appreciate the advice," Riley said calmly, lowering her hands to her sides. "I'm just here for exercise." Tank's grin widened. "Sensing opportunity. Exercise? Lady, this is a boxing gym, not a yoga studio. If you want to play around with fake fighting, there's a Planet Fitness down the street." Tommy Walsh snickered from the nearby speed bag, and several other fighters gathered closer, drawn by the promise of entertainment. This was the kind of moment that became gym legend, the stories that got told and retold until they grew into mythology. "I understand this is a serious training facility," Riley replied, her voice remaining steady despite the growing audience. "I'm not trying to interfere with anyone's preparation." "Interfere?" Tank laughed, a sound without warmth. "Honey, you couldn't interfere with my warm-up. But watching you pretend to be a fighter is honestly embarrassing, for all of us." He gestured around the gym, including the other fighters in his mockery. "We've got guys here training for professional fights, putting their bodies and careers on the line, and you're over there playing patty cake with the air." Rayleigh's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture, a subtle straightening that was barely perceptible. Her hands remained at her sides, relaxed but no longer completely passive. Bryce Patterson decided to join the show, stepping forward with the authority of someone who'd actually fought in major promotions. "Tank's got a point. This isn't a fitness class. The equipment here is for serious training, not for middle-aged women having a midlife crisis." The cruelty in Bryce's voice was casual, the kind of dismissive condescension that came from never having to consider how his words might land. He looked Riley up and down with obvious disdain, taking in her unremarkable appearance and clearly finding her wanting. "I mean, what's next?" Bryce continued, warming to his theme. "Are we going to start offering aerobics classes? Maybe some gentle stretching for the senior citizens?" The crowd of fighters laughed, feeding off each other's energy and Tank's obvious approval. In their world, respect was earned through demonstrated skill and proven toughness. Riley represented everything they saw as soft, amateur, unworthy of sharing their sacred space. Tommy Walsh, eager to impress the more established fighters, decided to pile on. "I've been watching her train for weeks. I've seen high school kids throw harder punches at bullies. She probably learned everything she knows from YouTube videos." Tank nodded approvingly at his protégé's contribution, then fixed his attention back on Riley with predatory focus. "Tell you what, sweetheart. Since you seem to think you belong here, why don't you show us what you've got? Hit the heavy bag. Let's see this devastating power you've been hiding." He gestured toward the professional-grade heavy bag he'd been using, a 120-pound leather monster reinforced with steel chains and designed to absorb punishment from heavyweight fighters. The bag bore the scars of thousands of training sessions, its surface worn smooth in places from the constant impact of powerful punches. "I don't think that's necessary," Riley said quietly. "Oh, but I do," Tank insisted, his voice taking on an edge that made several people in the gym uncomfortable. "See, when someone comes into my gym, my space, and pretends to be something they're not, it bothers me. It's disrespectful to everyone who's actually earned their place here." He stepped closer, using his size to intimidate, a technique that had worked countless times before in and out of the ring. At 6'4", he towered over Riley's 5'6" frame, casting her in his shadow both literally and figuratively. "So here's what's gonna happen," Tank continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the now silent gym. "You're gonna hit that bag with everything you've got. And when you barely make it move, when you probably hurt your little hands on real equipment, you're gonna admit you don't belong here. Then you're gonna pack up your cute little gym bag and find somewhere more appropriate for your fitness journey." The gym had become an amphitheater, every person present now focused on this confrontation. Vincent started to step forward, clearly uncomfortable with the direction things were heading, but Tank waved him off with casual authority. "No, coach, this needs to happen. We can't have people thinking this is some kind of casual fitness center. We've got a reputation to maintain." Riley looked around at the assembled faces, reading the mixture of anticipation, discomfort, and predatory excitement in their expressions. She could see that some of them, particularly the younger fighters, were uncomfortable with Tank's bullying, but unwilling to challenge someone with his status and power. "All right," she said simply. The word carried such quiet finality that it cut through the gym's tension like a blade. Tank's grin widened, anticipating an easy victory that would cement his dominance and provide entertainment for weeks to come. Riley walked toward the heavy bag with measured steps, each one deliberate and precise. She paused in front of the massive leather cylinder, studying it for a moment as if calculating something complex and mathematical. The gym held its collective breath, 43 people witnessing what they expected to be a humiliating demonstration of amateur weakness. She raised her hands, adjusting her simple black gloves with careful attention to detail. Her stance was nothing flashy, just a basic orthodox position that any beginner might adopt. Her breathing remained steady, her expression calm, showing no signs of the nervousness or aggression that usually preceded someone's first encounter with professional-grade equipment. Tank crossed his arms, already composing the jokes he'd tell about this moment. The other fighters positioned themselves for the best view of what promised to be an embarrassing spectacle. Even Vincent found himself watching with grim fascination, hoping the inevitable humiliation wouldn't be too severe. Riley took one deep breath, centering herself with the kind of meditation that comes from years of practice. Her right hand drew back with fluid precision, her entire body coiling like a spring loaded with decades of muscle memory and suppressed power. Then she struck. The punch traveled exactly 18 inches, covering that distance in a blur of motion too fast for most observers to track clearly. Her fist connected with the heavy bag at the precise center point, transferring every ounce of her 140-pound frame through perfect, kinetic alignment into a single devastating impact. The sound was like a cannon shot in the enclosed space. The 120-pound heavy bag, suspended by steel chains rated for twice its weight, exploded backward with such violence that it swung in a complete arc, the chains screaming under stress they'd never experienced. The entire gym setup shuddered, and for a moment, everyone present thought the mounting system might tear free from the reinforced ceiling beams. Tank's jaw dropped open. Tommy Walsh's speed bag rhythm faltered and stopped entirely. Bryce Patterson took an involuntary step backward, his brain struggling to process what his eyes had just witnessed. Vincent's clipboard clattered to the floor, forgotten. Riley stepped back from the still swaying bag, calmly removing her gloves with the same methodical attention she'd shown putting them on. Her breathing remained steady, her expression unchanged, as if she'd just completed a routine warm-up exercise rather than demonstrating the kind of punching power that most heavyweight champions would envy. The silence stretched on, broken only by the gradual slowing of the heavy bag's pendulum motion and the quiet sound of leather creaking under stress. 43 people stood frozen, their understanding of reality fundamentally altered by 3 seconds of explosive truth. Tank stared at the woman he'd been mocking, his mind racing to comprehend what he'd just witnessed. The bag was still swaying, the chains still settling, physical evidence that what had happened was real rather than some shared hallucination. "What the hell?" he whispered, the words escaping before he could stop them. Riley finished removing her gloves, placing them carefully in her worn gym bag with the same quiet precision that characterized everything she did. She looked up at Tank's stunned face, her hazel eyes meeting his with calm directness. "Thank you for the training opportunity," she said simply. I should probably get going. She turned to leave, but Tank's voice stopped her, though it came out as more of a croak than his usual commanding tone. Wait a minute. Riley paused, turning back with polite attention, as if the last 3 seconds hadn't just shattered every assumption in the room. Tank struggled to find words, his usual cocky demeanor completely abandoned. Who? What? How did you? I used to train, Riley said simply, her voice carrying no pride or boasting, just quiet fact. A long time ago. Vincent finally found his voice, though it came out rougher than usual. Ma'am, I've been running this gym for 23 years, and I've never seen anything like that. Riley's expression softened slightly at Vincent's respectful tone. I'm sorry if I caused any disruption. That wasn't my intention. Disruption? Tommy Walsh finally managed to speak, his voice cracking slightly. Lady, you just hit that bag harder than Tank does, and he's got 100 pounds on you. The comparison hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. Tank's face flushed. Red, partly from embarrassment and partly from the dawning realization that everything he thought he knew about strength, power, and dominance had just been turned upside down by a quiet woman in basic workout clothes. Where did you train? Bryce Patterson asked, his earlier condescension replaced by genuine curiosity, tinged with concern. I mean, what style was that? I've fought MMA, kickboxing, traditional boxing, and I've never seen anyone generate that kind of power from such a compact motion. Riley hesitated, and for the first time since entering the gym, she looked genuinely uncomfortable. It was military training, special programs. Not something I talk about much anymore. The admission changed the atmosphere. In the room immediately. Military training could mean anything from basic combat instruction to elite special forces preparation. But the kind of striking power they just witnessed suggested something far beyond standard military hand-to-hand combat courses. Tank found his voice again, though it lacked its earlier authority. How long ago? I left active service 12 years ago, Riley replied, her hand unconsciously moving to the small cross pendant at her throat. I don't really fight anymore. Don't fight anymore? Tank repeated, incredulous. Lady, what you just did to that bag. I train 6 hours a day, 7 days a week, and I couldn't generate that kind of impact if my life depended on it. Rayleigh's expression grew distant, as if she was remembering something painful. Fighting cost me everything that mattered. I promised myself I was done with all of that. She picked up her gym bag, clearly wanting to end the conversation, but Vincent stepped forward with the authority of someone who'd spent decades reading people and situations. Miss Carpenter, he said, consulting the membership paperwork he'd retrieved from the floor. I think there's more to your story than basic military training, what you just demonstrated. That's not something you learn in standard combat courses. Riley met his eyes for a long moment, and Vincent saw something there that made him understand this. Conversation was about much more than gym membership or training techniques. There was pain in those hazel eyes and loss and the kind of weight that comes from carrying secrets too heavy for one person to bear alone. Coach Rodriguez, she said finally, some stories are better left untold. I just want to train quietly, maintain my fitness, and not bother anyone. What happened here? It won't happen again, but Tank wasn't ready to let this go. His entire identity was built around being the most dangerous person in any room, and having that foundation shaken by someone he'd dismissed as irrelevant was too much for his ego to process. No way, he said, his voice gaining strength as shock gave way to challenge. You can't just do that and walk away. You can't embarrass me in front of everyone and then act like it was nothing. Riley turned back to face him, and for the first time, there was something sharp in her expression. I didn't embarrass you, Mr. Sullivan. You embarrassed yourself. I just declined to enable it. The words hit Tank like a physical blow, accurate and devastating in their quiet precision. Around the gym, he could see the faces of people who'd witnessed his humiliation, people who'd looked up to him as the undisputed king of this domain. "You want to make this right?" Tank said, his voice rising with desperation disguised as anger. "Get in the ring. Let's see how tough you really are when someone can hit back." The challenge hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet, and everyone present understood. They were witnessing something that would become gym legend regardless of how it played out. Riley looked at Tank for a long moment, then around at the assembled faces, reading the mixture of anticipation, concern, and morbid curiosity in their expressions. "Mr. Sullivan," she said quietly, "you don't want that fight." "The hell I don't," Tank shot back. "You sucker punched a bag. Anyone can do that if they get lucky. But in the ring, with a real opponent, you'll fold like every other pretender who thought they were tough." Rayleigh's expression grew sad, as if she was watching someone make a terrible mistake, despite her best efforts to prevent it. "I'm not a pretender, Mr. Sullivan. That's the problem." Something in her tone made Vincent step forward again, his instincts screaming that this situation was spiraling toward something dangerous. "Folks, maybe we should all take a step back here. Miss Carpenter has made it clear she's not interested in sparring, and Tank, you've got a title fight coming up. This isn't worth risking injury over." But Tank was beyond listening to reason, his pride wounded and his dominance challenged in the most public way possible. Everything he'd built his identity around was crumbling, and the only way he could see to salvage it was to prove that what had just happened was a fluke, an accident, a moment of luck that couldn't be repeated under real fighting conditions. "One round," he insisted, his voice taking on a pleading quality that undermined his attempt at intimidation. 3 minutes. You and me, winner takes all." Riley studied his face for a long moment, seeing the desperation beneath the bravado, the fear beneath the aggression. She understood better than anyone what it felt like to have your entire world turned upside down in a single moment, to have everything you thought you knew about yourself proven wrong. "Mr. Sullivan," she said gently, "losing to me won't prove anything except that you're not prepared for what I represent. And beating me won't restore what you think you've lost, because you never actually lost it. You just learned something new about the world." The wisdom in her words was lost on Tank, whose emotional state had moved far beyond rational thought. All he could see was the woman who'd made him look weak in front of everyone who mattered to him. And all he could think about was restoring the natural order through the only method he truly understood. "Are you scared?" he asked, playing his last card. "Is that it? All that military training, all that power, but when it comes down to real competition, you're just another coward hiding behind excuses." Riley's expression hardened slightly, and everyone in the gym suddenly felt the temperature drop several degrees. For just a moment, they glimpsed something beneath her calm exterior, something that made them understand why the military might have been interested in her particular talents. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice carrying an edge that made several people take involuntary steps backward, "I am many things, but a coward is not one of them." The words carried such quiet authority that Tank actually flinched, his bravado cracking like ice under pressure. But he'd committed himself to this path, and his pride wouldn't let him back down, even as his instincts screamed warnings he refused to hear. "Then prove it," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had carried moments earlier. Riley looked around the gym one more time, taking in the faces of people who'd become invested in this confrontation, despite themselves. She saw Vincent's concern, Tommy's fascination, Bryce's calculating interest, and beneath it all, the hunger for drama that drove people to slow down at accident scenes. 3 minutes, she said finally. 1 round. When it's over, we shake hands and this ends here. Tank's face lit up with savage satisfaction, already imagining his redemption. Deal. But as Riley walked toward the ring, Vincent caught her arm gently, his expression troubled. "Miss Carpenter, Are you sure about this? Tank's a professional fighter with real power. Whatever you did to that bag, a ring is different. He can hit back. Riley met his concerned gaze with something that might have been gratitude. Coach Rodriguez, I appreciate your concern. But Mr. Sullivan is about to learn why I stopped fighting 12 years ago. She climbed through the ropes with fluid grace, her movements precise and economical. Tank followed, bouncing on his feet and shadowboxing to warm up his confidence, returning as he entered his natural element. This was his domain, his kingdom, where size and strength and natural aggression determined outcomes. The assembled crowd pressed closer to the ring, phones emerging to capture what promised to be either Tank's redemption or his complete destruction. Vincent reluctantly took his position as referee, though everything about his body language suggested he thought this was a terrible idea. Gentlemen's rules, Vincent announced, though his voice carried doubt about how gentlemanly this was going to be. 3 minutes, touch gloves, break on my command. Tank extended his gloves with exaggerated ceremony, grinning with the confidence of someone who'd found his way back to familiar territory. Riley touched her gloves to his with simple acknowledgement, showing no emotion beyond quiet focus. The bell rang, and Tank immediately began stalking forward, using his reach and size advantages to pressure Riley toward the ropes. His game plan was obvious: overwhelm her with aggression, use his power to intimidate, and end this quickly before she could employ whatever technique had produced that devastating bag strike. Riley moved backward with precise footwork, staying just out of range while observing Tank's approach with analytical calm. She wasn't retreating out of fear, but gathering information, reading his patterns, and timing with the methodical precision of someone who understood violence as both art and science. Tank threw a testing jab, then another, each punch carrying enough power to stagger most opponents. Riley avoided them with minimal movement, her head shifting just enough to let the punches slide past without wasted motion. She looked like someone solving a complex but familiar problem rather than someone fighting for survival. Stand still and fight, Tank growled, increasing his pace and aggression. He threw a hook that would have dropped most men, but Riley ducked under it with fluid grace, the punch whistling harmlessly over her head. The crowd watched in fascination as the size difference became both more obvious and somehow less relevant. Tank looked like a predator hunting dangerous prey, while Riley moved like water, flowing around his attacks with effortless precision. 30 seconds passed, then 60, with Tank growing increasingly frustrated as none of his punches found their target. He was fighting someone who seemed to exist slightly outside normal time and space, always where he expected her not to be, never quite where his fists wanted to land. "What are you waiting for?" Tank demanded, breathing harder than he should have been after only a minute of action. "Fight back." Riley continued her defensive dance, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady. She appeared to be waiting for something, though what that might be remained unclear to everyone watching. It was at the 90-second mark that Tank made his crucial error. Frustrated by his inability to land a clean shot, he overcommitted to a massive right hand that carried all his power and all his anger. It was the kind of punch that could end fights instantly if it connected, but it left him off balance and exposed for the brief moment it took to recover. Riley saw the opening, like a mathematician sees the solution to an equation. Her response was instantaneous and precise, a counterpunch that traveled the exact distance required with perfect timing and devastating efficiency. The punch landed with the same sound they'd heard at the heavy bag, a sharp crack that seemed to come from the air itself rather than the impact of fist against flesh. Tank's forward momentum stopped instantly, his eyes going wide with shock and something approaching fear. For a moment that felt like eternity, he stood frozen in place, his brain struggling to process what had just happened. Then his knees buckled, and he dropped to the canvas like a controlled demolition, conscious but completely unable to control his body's response to the perfectly placed strike. The gym erupted in shocked silence, then chaos, as everyone tried to process what they'd just witnessed. Tank lay on his back, looking up at the ceiling with the expression of someone whose entire understanding of reality had just been restructured. Riley stood over him for a moment, her expression showing something that might have been sympathy. Then she removed her gloves and extended her hand to help him up, the gesture carrying more grace and dignity than Tank had shown her since the moment she'd walked into his gym. "Are you all right, Mr. Sullivan?" she asked, her voice carrying genuine concern rather than triumph. Tank accepted her help sitting up, though he remained on the canvas, still too shaken to trust his legs. What the hell was that?" "That," said a new voice from the gym entrance, "was a woman trying very hard not to hurt you." Everyone turned to see Coach Elena Vasquez standing in the doorway, her expression mixing surprise, recognition, and something approaching awe. Elena was a legend in West Coast fighting circles, a former women's bantamweight champion who'd transitioned to training elite fighters. Her presence at Iron Forge was unusual enough to command immediate attention. But the way she was looking at Riley suggested this wasn't a coincidental visit. "Riley Carpenter," Elena said, shaking her head in apparent disbelief. "I should have known." The use of Riley's full name, spoken with such recognition and respect, sent a ripple of new tension through the assembled crowd. Clearly, Elena knew exactly who Riley was, and her tone suggested that knowledge carried significant weight. "Hello, Elena," Riley replied, her voice carrying warmth for the first time since entering the gym. "It's been a long time." 12 years, Elena confirmed, stepping closer to the ring. "Not since San Antonio." The mention of San Antonio brought a visible change to Riley's expression, a shadow passing across her features like clouds blocking sunlight. Whatever had happened in San Antonio, it clearly carried painful memories. Tank finally managed to get to his feet, though he kept one hand on the ropes for support. His earlier arrogance had been completely replaced by bewildered respect, and perhaps a touch of fear. "You two know each other?" Vincent asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who suspected he was about to learn something that would change his understanding of everything that had just happened. Elena smiled, though there was sadness in it. "Know each other?" "Coach Rodriguez, Riley Carpenter, was the most dangerous fighter I ever had the privilege to work with. She was also the most principled, which is what ended her career and nearly destroyed her life." The revelation hung in the air like smoke, slowly filling the space with its implications. Riley had been a professional fighter, trained by one of the most respected coaches in the business, and apparently skilled enough to earn Elena's highest praise. "I don't understand," Tommy Walsh said, speaking for everyone present. "If she was a professional fighter, why didn't she say anything? Why let us think she was just some amateur?" Elena looked at Riley with an expression mixing admiration and sorrow. "Because telling that story means reliving the worst day of her life. And because the last time Riley Carpenter fought professionally, she chose to sacrifice everything rather than compromise her principles." Riley's hand moved unconsciously to the cross pendant at her throat, and her expression grew distant. Whatever Elena was referring to, it clearly carried weight that extended far beyond won or lost fights. "Elena," Riley said quietly, "maybe we should discuss this privately." "No," Elena replied firmly but kindly. "These people have earned the right to understand what they just witnessed. Especially Mr. Sullivan, who just learned what it feels like to be hit by someone who spent 6 years training specifically to end fights as quickly and efficiently as possible." Tank's face paled further as the implications sank in. He'd been mocking and challenging someone who'd been trained to neutralize threats with minimal effort, someone whose entire fighting system was built around ending confrontations before they could develop into extended conflicts. 6 years, Bryce Patterson repeated slowly. "Training for what? Elena's expression grew serious. Counter-terrorism operations. Specialized military programs that most people never hear about. Riley wasn't just a fighter, she was a surgical instrument designed to neutralize specific types of threats in specific environments. The gym had become completely silent except for the sound of people breathing and trying to process information that challenged everything they thought they knew about combat sports and military training. The Army wanted someone who could end fights instantly, Elena continued. Someone who could neutralize threats without causing unnecessary casualties or collateral damage. Riley was perfect for that role because she combined devastating technical skill with absolute moral clarity about when and how force should be applied. Riley remained silent, but her expression suggested she was reliving memories that brought both pride and pain in equal measure. Then why did she leave? Vincent asked, his voice respectful but curious. Elena looked at Riley for permission to continue, receiving a slight nod in response. Because 12 years ago, Riley was ordered to do something that violated her moral code. Something that would have achieved military objectives but cost innocent lives. And when she refused to follow that order, she lost everything that mattered. To her, the weight of implications settled over the crowd like a heavy blanket. They were looking at someone who'd chosen principle over career, conscience over convenience, moral clarity over personal advancement. Tank finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. What happened to you after? You refused? Riley's expression grew distant, as if she was seeing scenes that existed only in memory. I was court-martialed, stripped of rank, and discharged. Lost my career, my identity, my purpose. And while I was fighting legal battles and trying to salvage my reputation, my sister Samantha was killed in a car accident. The silence that followed was profound, heavy with the weight of loss and sacrifice that no victory could restore. Samantha was everything to me, Riley continued, her voice steady but carrying years of pain. She was 26, brilliant, kind, planning to be a teacher. She died while I was fighting to prove I'd made the right choice, and I wasn't there for her when she needed me most. Elena stepped closer to the ring, her expression showing deep empathy. Riley blamed herself for Samantha's death. Believed that if she'd just followed orders, if she'd compromised her principles, she would have been available when Samantha needed her. That's why I stopped fighting, Riley continued, her voice carrying the weight of 12 years of self-imposed exile. Every time I used these skills, every time I demonstrated what I was capable of, it reminded me of the choice that cost me everything. It reminded me that being right doesn't always mean being rewarded. Tank slowly sat down on the ring's edge. His legs finally steady enough to support him, but his mind still reeling from everything he'd learned. The woman he'd been mocking, the person he'd dismissed as a suburban amateur, had been trained by the United States military to be a human weapon. More than that, she'd sacrificed her entire career rather than use those skills in ways that violated her conscience. I don't understand, he said, looking up at Riley with something approaching reverence. If you were that good, if you had that kind of training and ability, why didn't you just find another way to use it? Private security, law enforcement, professional fighting? Riley's smile was sad but understanding. Because every time I fought, every time I demonstrated what I could do, people got hurt. Not just physically, though that was bad enough. They got hurt in ways that lasted long after bruises healed and bones mended. She gestured around the gym, taking in the faces of people who were still processing what they'd witnessed. Look at everyone here right now. Look at how they're staring at me, how they're afraid to get too close. I've become something other than human in their eyes, something dangerous and unpredictable. Elena nodded sadly. Riley always understood that true power carries responsibility. She knew that her abilities could solve problems, could protect people, could serve her country. But she also knew that using them changed how people saw her, how they interacted with her, how they understood what she represented. Tommy Walsh, who had been silent throughout the revelations, finally found his voice. But you could have made millions in professional fighting. With those skills, you could have been champion of the world in any division. Money was never the point. Riley replied, and championship belts don't bring back the people you lose while you're chasing them. She climbed down from the ring with the same fluid grace she'd shown entering it, her movements precise and economical. As she collected her gym bag, Riley seemed to shrink back into the unremarkable woman who'd entered Iron Forge 3 weeks ago, as if the demonstration of her abilities had been an aberration rather than a glimpse of her true nature. "Ms. Carpenter," Vincent said, his voice carrying deep respect, "I owe you an apology. We all do. The way you were treated here today, the assumptions we made." Riley shook her head, cutting him off gently. "Coach Rodriguez, you don't owe me anything. You treated me exactly as I presented myself. I came here wanting to be invisible, to blend in, to be just another gym member working on fitness. In many ways, that's exactly what happened. Until Tank pushed you into revealing who you really are," Bryce Patterson said, his earlier condescension completely replaced by genuine curiosity and respect. "Tank didn't push me into anything," Riley corrected, looking at the heavyweight fighter with compassionate understanding. "He challenged someone he thought was weak and untrained. That's not unusual or particularly cruel. It's human nature to test boundaries, to establish hierarchies, to prove strength through comparison." Tank flinched at her words, recognizing the truth in them, but also hearing the implicit forgiveness. "But I was wrong. I was completely, embarrassingly wrong." "You were uninformed," Riley said simply. "There's a difference. You made assumptions based on limited information, just like everyone does every day. The only difference is that your assumptions happen to involve someone with a very specific and unusual background." Elena stepped forward, her expression mixing professional interest with personal concern. "Riley, what are you doing now? I mean, for work, for purpose? You can't just be keeping books for small businesses and training quietly in neighborhood gyms." Riley's expression grew guarded, and for a moment the assembled crowd saw a flash of the defensive mechanism she'd developed over 12 years of carrying secrets and managing pain. "I do what I can to help people, quietly, without drawing attention." "That's not an answer," Elena pressed gently but firmly. "You were trained to serve, to protect, to make a difference in ways that most people never could. Are you really content to waste all of that potential in self-imposed exile?" The question hung in the air like smoke, challenging, uncomfortable. Riley looked around at the faces watching her, reading the mixture of curiosity, respect, and expectation in their expressions. "Elena, you know what happened the last time I tried to serve a cause bigger than myself? You know what it cost me, what it cost Samantha. I can't take that risk again." "Samantha wouldn't want you to stop living because she died," Elena said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd known both sisters. "She was proud of what you represented, proud of the choices you made even when they were difficult." Riley's hand moved unconsciously to her pendant, and her expression showed the internal struggle between duty and self-preservation that had defined her existence for over a decade. "Besides," Elena continued, "helping people doesn't have to mean military service or government work. There are other ways to use your skills, other ways to make a difference that don't require sacrificing everything you care about." Tank finally stood up, his legs steady now, but his perspective permanently altered. "What kind of help are we talking about? I mean, what could someone with your background do that would actually matter?" Riley studied his face, seeing genuine curiosity rather than the earlier mockery or challenge. "There are people who need protection but can't afford professional security. There are situations where law enforcement is limited by policy or jurisdiction. There are problems that require someone who can move quietly, act decisively, and handle confrontation without escalation." "Like what?" Tommy asked, drawn into the conversation despite himself. Riley hesitated, clearly debating how much to reveal. 3 months ago, I helped a family whose teenage daughter was being stalked by an ex-boyfriend. The police couldn't do much because he was technically staying within legal boundaries, but he was making her life hell and escalating toward real violence. She paused, remembering. I spent 2 weeks documenting his patterns, identifying his vulnerabilities, understanding his psychology. Then I had a conversation with him about the consequences of continuing his behavior. What kind of conversation? Bryce asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. The kind where someone realizes that their actions have attracted the attention of someone who could make their life very difficult if they chose to, Riley replied, simply. He stopped bothering the girl immediately and moved to a different state within a month. Vincent nodded slowly, beginning to understand. You convinced him that continuing was more dangerous than stopping. I helped him reach that conclusion on his own, Riley corrected. I never threatened him directly, never touched him, never did anything that could be considered assault or intimidation. I simply made it clear that his behavior had consequences he hadn't considered. Elena smiled for the first time since entering the gym. That's exactly the kind of thing you should be doing more of. Using your skills to help people who have nowhere else to turn, solving problems that can't be addressed through normal channels. And keeping it quiet, Riley added. No publicity, no recognition, no building a reputation or brand around it. Just helping when help is needed and disappearing back into anonymity afterward. Tank was studying Riley with newfound respect. His earlier antagonism completely transformed into something approaching admiration. How many people have you helped over the years? Riley shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with the question. I don't keep count. It's not about numbers or achievements. It's about being useful when usefulness matters. But there have been others, Elena pressed. Other situations where you've intervened when normal solutions weren't available. A few, Riley admitted reluctantly. A woman whose abusive husband was using legal loopholes to maintain custody of their children. A small business owner being extorted by people who knew the police couldn't touch them. A veteran having trouble with predatory lenders who were taking advantage of his PTSD. Each example painted a picture of someone using extraordinary skills to address ordinary injustices, someone who'd found a way to serve others without serving institutions that might demand moral compromises. How do these people find you? Vincent asked. I mean, if you're trying to stay invisible, how do they know you're available to help? Riley's expression grew thoughtful. Word spreads quietly among people who need help. Someone helps someone, who mentions it to someone else who needs similar assistance. It's not organized or systematic. It just happens when it needs to happen. Tommy shook his head in amazement. So you're like some kind of underground problem solver. Someone people call when the normal systems fail them. I'm someone who occasionally helps people, Riley corrected. Nothing more dramatic or important than that. But Elena wasn't buying the modest deflection. Riley, what you're describing is exactly what your military training prepared you for. You're using your skills to protect people who can't protect themselves, to solve problems that require someone with your specific abilities and moral clarity, without the institutional support or official sanction that made it so complicated before. Bryce added, beginning to understand the elegant solution Riley had created for herself. Riley nodded slowly. When I work alone, when I choose my own cases and set my own parameters, I don't have to worry about orders that conflict with my conscience. I don't have to choose between duty to country and duty to humanity. And you don't have to risk losing everything again, Elena said gently, because you're not building anything that can be taken away. The insight hung in the air, revealing the careful balance Riley had constructed between service and self-preservation, between using her gifts and protecting her heart from further loss. Tank had been quiet for several minutes, processing everything he'd learned and apparently reaching some internal conclusion. "Miss Carpenter," he said finally, his voice carrying none of its earlier arrogance, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you respect for choices I never could have made." Riley looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Tank said, "that everything I am, everything I've accomplished, is built on using my strength to dominate other people. Career, my reputation, my identity. It's all about proving I'm stronger and tougher than anyone else." He gestured around the gym, taking in the equipment and atmosphere that had shaped his understanding of power and success. "But you had strength I can't even comprehend, and you chose to give it up rather than use it in ways that felt wrong. That's a kind of courage I'm not sure I possess." Riley's expression softened. "Mr. Sullivan, courage isn't about being willing to sacrifice everything for principle. Sometimes courage is about finding ways to live with compromise, to work within imperfect systems while trying to make them better. Is that what you think I should do?" Tank asked. "Accept that the fighting world is corrupt and violent and try to make it better from within?" Riley studied his face for a moment, reading the genuine desire for guidance in his expression. "I think you should figure out what you're fighting for, not just what you're fighting against. Purpose makes all the difference in how you handle the moral complexities of any profession." Elena nodded approvingly. Riley always understood that the why matters more than the how. It's what made her such an effective soldier and what made her such a principled person. "But it's also what made military service unsustainable for me," Riley added. "When the why starts conflicting with institutional requirements, you have to choose between effectiveness and integrity." Tommy had been listening intently, clearly struggling with concepts that challenged his understanding of strength and success. "So what advice would you give to someone like me? Someone who's trying to build a career in fighting, but doesn't want to lose their soul in the process?" Riley considered the question carefully. "Remember that every opponent is someone's son or daughter, someone's brother or sister. Fight to win. Fight with everything you have, but never forget the person across from you is human. Respect them, learn from them, and help them up when the fight is over. And understand that real strength isn't about dominating others," Elena added. "It's about controlling yourself, knowing when to fight and when to walk away, understanding the difference between necessary force and excessive violence." Bryce, who had been silent for several minutes, finally spoke up. "Miss Carpenter, can I ask you something personal?" Riley nodded, though her expression remained guarded. "Do you ever regret the choice you made? Walking away from your military career, losing everything, spending 12 years in exile? Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you just followed orders?" The question touched something deep and painful in Riley's expression, and for a moment, everyone present saw the weight she'd been carrying for over a decade. "Every day," she said quietly, "every single day I wonder if Samantha would still be alive if I'd made different choices. Every day I question whether my principles were worth the cost they demanded." She paused, looking around at the faces, watching her with respectful attention. "But then I remember the faces of the people who would have died if I'd followed those orders. I remember that my choice meant innocent people gotta go home to their families, gotta live lives that would have been cut short by military expediency." "And that makes it worth it?" Vincent asked. Rayleigh's smile was sad but certain. "It makes it necessary. Whether it was worth it is a question I'll probably spend the rest of my life trying to answer." Elena stepped closer, her expression mixing professional respect with personal affection. "Riley, I have a proposition for you." Riley's expression immediately became wary. "Elena, I'm not interested in coming out of retirement, if that's what you're suggesting." "Not retirement from fighting," Elena clarified. "Retirement from hiding. What you've been doing for the past 12 years, helping people quietly, solving problems that can't be addressed through normal channels, that's valuable work. but you're limiting your impact by working alone and staying invisible. I'm also limiting my exposure to the kind of complications that destroyed my life before, Riley pointed out. But you're also limiting your ability to help people who need it, Elena countered. There are situations out there, people in desperate circumstances, that require exactly the kind of intervention you're uniquely qualified to provide. Tank leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. What kind of situations? Elena's expression grew serious. Human trafficking networks that operate just outside law enforcement jurisdiction. Domestic violence cases where the legal system has failed and private solutions are the only option. Corporate corruption that destroys communities while staying technically legal. She looked directly at Riley, her voice carrying passionate conviction. Problems that require someone with your specific combination of skills, moral clarity, and operational independence. Riley shook her head slowly. Elena, you're describing exactly the kind of work that led to impossible choices and devastating consequences before. I can't risk going down that path again. It wouldn't be like before, Elena said, her voice steady. You'd be working on your own terms, choosing your cases, setting your own boundaries. No pressure from an institution, no orders from higher-ups who don't grasp the human cost behind their decisions. And no institutional safety net when things go south, Riley replied. No support, no resources, and no legal cover when things get messy. Bryce, who had been listening quietly, leaned forward with interest. But also no red tape when doing what's right clashes with protocol. Riley gave him a look surprised but respectful. That's a fair point. Working independently means you never have to choose between following orders and doing what your conscience tells you. It also means owning the full weight of the consequences, Elena added. Which, let's be honest, you've already been doing for over a decade. The only difference would be broadening the kind of challenges you're willing to face. Tommy, who had remained quiet until now, spoke up with unexpected thoughtfulness. Could you train other people? I mean, if there are really that many situations where your kind of skills are needed, wouldn't it make sense to teach others how to handle them too? Riley blinked, caught off guard by the suggestion. Training others would mean disclosing methods that are technically still classified. But if you're not under military restrictions anymore, Vincent interjected, and you're operating privately for humanitarian reasons, doesn't that give you more freedom in how you apply and share what you know? Riley considered. It's not just about combat or self-defense. What I was trained in involves psychology, threat assessment, de-escalation, knowing when force is necessary and when it's not. Exactly the kind of skills people in high-risk civilian jobs could use, Elena said. Social workers dealing with dangerous situations, teachers in tough neighborhoods, healthcare professionals in unsafe areas. People who need to protect others but can't depend on traditional security, Tank added, starting to see the wider implications. Riley fell silent, clearly grappling with ideas she'd deliberately avoided for years. If I train people, I'm also responsible for what they do with that knowledge. I'd have to live with the risk that they might misuse it. But think of the good you could multiply, Elena said gently. Instead of helping one person at a time, you could help dozens become capable of making a difference. The mood in the room shifted. What had started as a personal discussion had evolved into something larger, something with the potential to reshape not just Riley's future, but the lives of many others who might benefit from her unique perspective. There's another angle to consider, Bryce said thoughtfully. If you start training others or tackling more widespread problems, you'll need allies. People you trust, people who understand not just what you can do, but why you do it the way you do. He glanced around at the group, people who had seen Riley in action, who had heard her story. People like us, who watched you walk away from everything rather than betray your values. Tank nodded. Yeah, today I learned there's a difference between strength and power, between fighting and violence. Maybe it's time I learned more. Riley looked at each person in the room, reading their sincerity. Hours ago, they'd seen her as little more than a curiosity. Now they were treating her as a leader. Someone whose decisions made them question what they thought they knew about service, courage, and ethical responsibility. "If I were to consider this," she said slowly, "it would have to be done right, quietly, with unwavering commitment to using these skills only for protection and support, never for aggression or ego." "A school," Vincent said suddenly. "Not a commercial gym, not a dojo for trophies. A place where people can learn, not just to defend themselves, but to do it ethically from someone who knows the weight of those decisions." Elena's face lit up. "A training center focused on service, not competition. Empowering people to step into dangerous roles without turning them into weapons." The idea was taking shape, no longer abstract, but something tangible. Riley could see it, even as her expression remained cautious. "It would require absolute transparency," she said. "No hidden motives. No secret agendas. And I wouldn't train anyone whose goals I couldn't stand behind. And it would take a community," Elena added. "People committed to the principle that real strength means knowing when not to fight." Tank suddenly straightened, eyes widening as something clicked inside him. This is what's been missing. Why winning in the ring never felt like enough. Why fighting left me hollow." He looked at Riley with something approaching wonder. "I've been training my whole life to hurt people more effectively than they could hurt me. But you've been training to protect people, to solve problems, to make situations better rather than just winning them." Riley nodded slowly. "The most important lesson I learned in military training wasn't about techniques or tactics. It was about understanding the difference between necessary force and excessive violence, between protecting others and protecting yourself." "And that's what you could teach," Tommy said, his voice carrying growing excitement. "Not just how to fight, but when to fight, when to walk away, when to find solutions that don't require violence at all." The possibilities were multiplying, creating a vision of something unprecedented in their experience. A place where Riley's unique combination of skills, principles, and hard-won wisdom could serve people who needed protection, but couldn't find it through conventional means. "I'd need to think about it," Riley said finally. "This isn't the kind of decision I can make quickly or lightly." "Of course," Elena said. "But Riley, what happened here today, what these people witnessed and learned, that's exactly the kind of impact you could have on a larger scale. You changed how everyone here thinks about strength, about courage, about the responsibility that comes with power." Riley looked around the gym one more time, taking in the faces of people who had started as strangers and antagonists, but had become something approaching, allies through shared experience and mutual understanding. "If I did decide to move forward with something like this," she said slowly, "I'd want all of you involved. Not as students or employees, but as partners who understand both the potential and the risks of what we'd be attempting." The offer hung in the air like a bridge between past and future, between the life Riley had been living and the life she might choose to embrace. Each person present understood they were being invited into something significant, something that could transform not just their own understanding of strength and service, but their ability to make a meaningful difference in the world. Tank was the first to respond, his voice carrying none of its earlier arrogance, but all of its earlier conviction. "Miss Carpenter, after what I learned about myself today, after seeing what real strength looks like, I'd be honored to be part of whatever you decide to build." One by one, the others added their agreement, creating a circle of commitment that felt both spontaneous and inevitable. Riley looked at each face, reading the sincerity and understanding in their expressions, seeing people who had been transformed by witnessing her story and were ready to be part of writing its next chapter. For the first time in 12 years, Riley Carpenter began to imagine a future that didn't require hiding from her past. A way to use her gifts that didn't demand sacrificing her principles. A path forward that honored both Samantha's memory and the people she might still be able to help. The woman who had walked into Iron Forge Boxing Gym 3 weeks ago, seeking invisibility, was discovering that sometimes the most powerful choice is the decision to be seen. The morning after the confrontation at Iron Forge, Riley sat in her small duplex kitchen, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Through the window, she could see the familiar Portland skyline emerging from the early fog, the same view that had greeted her for the past 8 years. Everything looked identical to yesterday, but something fundamental had shifted in her world. Her phone buzzed with the 7th text message of the morning, all from people who'd been at the gym the previous day. Elena had sent 3 messages, each one more passionate about the training center idea. Vincent had texted twice about scheduling a meeting to discuss logistics. Even Tommy had reached out, asking if she'd be willing to teach his younger sister some basic self-defense techniques. Riley set the phone aside without responding to any of them. She'd spent 12 years perfecting the art of existing quietly, of helping people without creating waves or building expectations. Yesterday's events had shattered that carefully constructed anonymity, and she wasn't sure how to process the implications. The sound of her doorbell interrupted her brooding. Riley moved to the window, expecting to see a delivery driver or perhaps a neighbor. Instead, she found Elena Vasquez standing on her small front porch, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression of determined patience. "I know you're in there, Riley," Elena called through the door. "And I know you're overthinking everything that happened yesterday. Let me in so we can talk about it properly." Riley hesitated for a moment, then unlocked the door. Elena had been her mentor once, the person who'd helped her understand that fighting could be both art and service. If anyone deserved a hearing, it was Elena. "You brought coffee," Riley observed, accepting the cup Elena offered. "I brought perspective," Elena corrected, settling into one of the 2 chairs at Riley's small dining table. "And caffeine to help you process it." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both women looking out at the city, awakening beyond Riley's window. Elena had always understood the value of quiet moments, the importance of letting thoughts settle before forcing conversations. "You're scared," Elena said finally, her voice carrying observation rather than judgment. Riley nodded slowly. "Terrified, actually. Yesterday, I broke every rule I've lived by for 12 years. I revealed who I am, demonstrated what I can do, and let people see behind the mask I've been wearing. And the world didn't end," Elena pointed out gently. "In fact, it got a little bit better. Tank learned something about humility and real strength. Tommy started thinking about protecting others instead of just advancing his own career. Vincent saw what authentic service looks like. They also learned that someone with my background exists in their community," Riley countered. "They learned that I've been lying to them about who I am since the day I walked into that gym." Elena shook her head. "You weren't lying. You were protecting yourself and them from complications they weren't ready to handle. There's a difference." Riley sipped her coffee, considering Elena's words. "But now they know. And now they have expectations, ideas about what I should do with that knowledge and those abilities." "Do their expectations matter more than your own judgment?" Elena asked. "Because as I recall, you've never been someone who let other people's opinions dictate your choices." The question struck deeper than Elena probably intended. Riley had spent 12 years making decisions based on avoiding other people's expectations, on preventing the kind of involvement that might lead to impossible choices and devastating losses. "That's exactly the problem," Riley said quietly. "For 12 years, I've been making choices based on fear. Fear of getting involved, fear of caring too much, fear of losing people I might come to value." She stood up, walking to the window and looking out at the city beyond. Yesterday, for the first time since Samantha died, I let myself care about what happened to other people. I let myself get involved in their problems, their conflicts, their growth. Elena joined her at the window, standing close enough to offer support without crowding. And how did that feel? Riley was quiet for a long moment, searching for words to describe emotions she'd been suppressing for over a decade. Terrifying, exhilarating, right, in a way that nothing has felt right since I left the military. But also dangerous. Elena observed. Incredibly dangerous, Riley agreed. Because now I remember what it feels like to use my training for something meaningful. I remember what it's like to make a difference in people's lives, to solve problems that matter. Elena smiled, recognizing the internal conflict that had defined Riley's existence since her discharge from the military. And you're afraid that remembering will make it impossible to go back to the quiet, invisible life you've built. Riley nodded, her reflection in the window showing the struggle between desire and caution that had become her constant companion. The safe thing would be to disappear again. Change gyms, maybe change cities. Go back to helping people one at a time, quietly, without building relationships or taking on responsibilities that might lead to complications. But you won't do that, Elena said with quiet certainty. How can you be so sure? Elena's smile carried years of friendship and professional respect. Because yesterday you saw Tank's face when he realized what real strength looks like. You saw Tommy start thinking about protecting others instead of just winning fights. You saw Vincent understand what authentic service means. She paused, letting the impact of her words settle. And you remembered what it feels like to be a teacher instead of just a survivor. The observation hit Riley like a physical blow, accurate and devastating in its precision. She had forgotten how much she'd once loved the teaching aspect of her military role, the satisfaction of helping others develop skills and perspectives that could serve them throughout their lives. Teaching was always the part one loved most, Riley admitted. Not the operations, not the missions, not even the successful outcomes. It was watching people discover capabilities they didn't know they possessed, seeing them develop confidence and judgment that would serve them in situations I'd never be there to help with. Elena nodded encouragingly. And that's exactly what happened yesterday. Tank didn't just learn that he'd underestimated you. He learned something about himself, about the difference between bullying and strength, about the kind of person he wants to become. Riley turned from the window, her expression showing the first signs of genuine interest she'd felt in years. The training center idea you mentioned yesterday. Tell me more about what you were imagining. Elena's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this question. Not a commercial gym or traditional martial arts school. Something more like what the military taught you, but adapted for civilian applications and guided by the moral framework that led you to walk away from your career. She moved to the table, pulling out her phone and opening a note-taking app. A place where people could learn practical self-defense, but also conflict resolution, situational awareness, and the psychological tools they need to protect themselves and others, without becoming aggressive or violent. Riley sat back down, her professional interest overriding her personal caution. What kind of people would we be training? Teachers in dangerous schools who need to know how to de-escalate violent situations without becoming part of the problem, Elena said, warming to her theme. Social workers who enter hostile environments but can't carry weapons or rely on police protection. Healthcare workers in emergency departments who deal with violent, intoxicated, or mentally ill patients. She paused, watching Riley's expression. Carefully. Parents who want to teach their children real confidence instead of just martial arts techniques. Domestic violence survivors who need to know how to recognize and avoid dangerous situations. Each example resonated with Riley's understanding of the problems that traditional self-defense training failed to address. Most martial arts schools focused on technique and competition rather than practical application in real-world conflict situations. The psychological component would be crucial, Riley said, her analytical mind engaging with the challenge. Most people who need these skills aren't naturally aggressive or physically imposing. They need to understand how to project confidence, how to read dangerous situations before they escalate, how to de-escalate when possible and respond decisively when necessary. Elena nodded enthusiastically. Exactly, and they need to learn from someone who understands the difference between necessary force and excessive violence, someone who's made the hard choices about when to fight and when to walk away. Riley stood up, pacing as ideas began to form. We'd need to be extremely careful about screening students. The techniques I learned can be devastating if used improperly or for the wrong reasons. Which is why the moral framework would be as important as the physical training, Elena agreed. Students would need to demonstrate not just competence but judgment, not just skill but character. The conversation was taking on momentum, transforming from abstract possibility into concrete planning. Riley could feel her professional instincts awakening. The same analytical approach she'd once applied to military operations now focused on civilian protection and empowerment. Location would be important, she said, her mind racing through logistical considerations. Somewhere accessible but not prominent, professional but not intimidating. Large enough for practical training but small enough to maintain the personal attention that this kind of instruction requires. Elena smiled, recognizing the shift in Riley's tone from cautious interest to active planning. I might have some ideas about that. There's a warehouse space in southeast Portland that's been vacant for 2 years. Good bones, plenty of room. Reasonable rent. Riley paused in her pacing, looking at Elena with suspicion and admiration. How long have you been planning this? Since about 10 minutes after I walked into Iron Forge yesterday and saw what you did to that heavy bag. Elena admitted. I've been thinking about this kind of training center for years, but I never knew anyone with the right combination of skills and principles to make it work. Until you found me accidentally demonstrating both in front of a crowd of witnesses, Riley said wryly. Sometimes the universe has a sense of timing, Elena replied. The question is whether you're ready to stop running from your potential and start embracing it. Riley sat back down, her expression serious but no longer defensive. If we did this, if we actually moved forward with building something like this, we'd need to establish clear principles from the beginning. Rules about who we train, how we train them, what we expect from them after they leave. Elena pulled out a notebook, ready to capture ideas as they developed. What would those principles look like? Riley was quiet for a moment, drawing on 12 years of hard-won wisdom about the intersection of skill, power, and responsibility. First principle: we never train anyone who wants to hurt people. This isn't about creating fighters or weapons. It's about empowering protectors and peacemakers. Elena wrote rapidly as Riley continued. Second principle: students must demonstrate emotional stability and moral judgment before learning advanced techniques. Physical skills without psychological maturity create dangerous people. Third principle, Riley said, her voice carrying the weight of personal experience. We teach de-escalation before engagement, walking away before fighting, finding peaceful solutions before resorting to force. Elena looked up from her notes. And if peaceful solutions aren't possible? Riley's expression hardened slightly, showing a glimpse of the warrior she'd once been. Then we teach people to end conflicts quickly, decisively, and with minimal harm to everyone involved, including themselves. The conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from curriculum design to student evaluation protocols. Elena's enthusiasm was infectious, but Riley could see that her mentor understood the serious responsibilities they'd be undertaking. There's one more thing we need to discuss, Riley said finally. The people from yesterday. Tank, Tommy, Vincent, Bryce. If we move forward with this, what role would they play? Elena's expression grew thoughtful. That depends partly on what they want and partly on what we need. But I think yesterday proved that they're capable of growth, of learning not just techniques but principles. Riley nodded slowly. Tank surprised me. When he realized what he'd been doing, how he'd been treating me, his response wasn't defensiveness or anger. It was genuine remorse and a desire to understand. That's rare, Elena observed. Most people, when confronted with evidence that they've been wrong about something fundamental, double down on their mistakes rather than admitting error. Tommy showed real interest in learning about protection rather than just competition. Riley continued. And Vincent demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership and moral authority that students would need to see modeled. Elena made additional notes. Bryce might be more complicated. He's got real fighting experience and technical knowledge, but also some ego issues that would need to be addressed. Riley considered this. Everyone has ego issues when they're dealing with skills they've built their identity around. The question is whether they can set aside their ego long enough to learn something new. Her phone buzzed again, and this time Riley glanced at the message. It was from Vincent, asking if she'd be willing to meet with him and Tank to discuss how they might support whatever she decided to do next. Riley showed the message to Elena, who smiled knowingly. They're not going to let you disappear again. You know, yesterday changed them as much as it changed you. That's what I'm afraid of, Riley admitted. Once people know what you're capable of, they start depending on you in ways that can become overwhelming. Elena's expression grew serious. Riley, can I ask you something personal? Riley nodded, though her posture tensed slightly. Do you think Samantha would want you to spend the rest of your life avoiding meaningful connections because you're afraid of losing people? The question hit like a physical blow, and Riley felt tears she'd been suppressing for 12 years suddenly threatened to surface. That's not fair, Elena. It's not meant to be fair, Elena replied gently. It's meant to be honest. You've spent 12 years punishing yourself for choices that saved lives, for principles that most people would admire, for a moral courage that cost you everything but defined who you are. Riley turned back to the window, struggling with emotions she'd kept buried for over a decade. Samantha died while I was fighting to prove I'd made the right choice. If I'd just followed orders, if I'd compromised my principles, I would have been available when she needed me. And if you'd followed orders, if you'd compromised your principles, innocent people would have died, Elena countered. Samantha knew who you were, knew what you stood for. Do you really think she'd want you to abandon those principles because honoring them cost her the chance to have you nearby during her final moments? The tears came then, 12 years of suppressed grief and guilt finally finding release. Elena moved to stand beside Riley, offering physical support without trying to fix or minimize the pain. She was so proud of you, Elena said quietly. Even when the court-martial was happening, even when the media was painting you as a traitor or a coward, Samantha never doubted that you'd made the right choice. Riley's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. How do you know that? Elena was quiet for a moment. Because she called me the week before she died. She wanted to know if there was anything she could do to help with your legal defense. Any way she could support you through the process. Riley turned to stare at Elena, shock replacing grief in her expression. She never told me that. She didn't want to add to your stress, Elena explained. But she was furious about how you were being treated, proud of the choice you'd made, and determined to help you rebuild your life afterward. The revelation recontextualized years of guilt and self-recrimination. Samantha hadn't died disapproving of Riley's choices or disappointed in her sister's priorities. She died while actively trying to support the principles that had defined Riley's character. She believed in what you stood for, Elena continued. And I think she'd be heartbroken to know that her death became another reason for you to hide from the world instead of serving it. Riley sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the collision of grief, relief, and possibility that Elena's words had created. I've been carrying this guilt for 12 years, believing that my principles cost me the most important person in my life. Your principles saved lives, Elena said firmly. Samantha's death was a tragic accident that had nothing to do with your choices or your character. The only connection is that you weren't available to prevent something that probably couldn't have been prevented anyway. Riley looked up at Elena with something approaching wonder. Why didn't you tell me this before? Elena's smile was sad but understanding. Because you weren't ready to hear it before. You needed to work through the guilt and grief on your own timeline. But now, when you're considering stepping back into a role where you can make a difference in people's lives, now you need to understand that Samantha would have supported that choice. The emotional breakthrough seemed to clear something in Riley's mind, allowing her to see possibilities she'd been afraid to consider. The training center. If we did this right, if we built something that honored both effective technique and moral responsibility, we could help a lot of people. Elena nodded enthusiastically. People who are currently vulnerable, who need skills and confidence, but can't find training that addresses their real-world needs. Riley stood up, her posture straighter than it had been in years. We'd need to start small. Maybe a pilot program with carefully selected students, people who genuinely need these skills for protection rather than aggression. I might have some ideas about that too, Elena said. There's a women's shelter downtown that's been asking for self-defense training for their residents. The director is frustrated with traditional martial arts programs that don't address the specific psychological and practical challenges that domestic violence survivors face. Riley's eyes lit up with professional interest. That's perfect. Women who've escaped abusive relationships need skills that go far beyond physical techniques. They need to rebuild confidence, learn to trust their instincts, understand how to recognize and avoid dangerous situations. Elena made more notes as Riley's enthusiasm built. And they need to learn from someone who understands trauma, who won't re-traumatize them with aggressive training methods or unrealistic scenarios. Exactly, Riley agreed. Traditional self-defense classes often assume that students are naturally assertive and physically confident. But trauma survivors need to rebuild those qualities as part of learning protective skills. The conversation had transformed from abstract possibility into concrete planning, with Riley's expertise and Elena's connections creating a framework for something unprecedented in their experience. When could we start? Riley asked, surprising herself with her own eagerness. Elena grinned. How soon do you want to change your life? Riley looked around her small, quiet duplex, taking in the carefully controlled environment she'd created to minimize risk and complexity. Then she thought about Tank's transformation yesterday, about Tommy's questions about protecting others, about Vincent's respect for authentic service. What if we invited the people from yesterday to be part of the pilot program? She said. Suddenly, not as students exactly, but as partners in developing the curriculum and testing the approach. Elena's eyes widened with possibility. That's brilliant. They've already been through their own transformation process. They understand both the techniques and the principles. They could help us design training that addresses the real challenges people face. Riley nodded, ideas flowing faster than she could process them. Tank could help us understand how to work with people who've built their identity around physical dominance. Tommy could help us connect with younger students who need alternatives to competitive fighting culture. Vincent could help with the business and operational aspects, Elena added. And Bryce could provide technical expertise while learning about the psychological and moral components he's been missing. The framework was taking shape, transforming from Elena's initial vision into something more collaborative and comprehensive. Riley could see how each person's strengths and perspectives could contribute to building something greater than any of them could create alone. There's one more thing, Riley said, her expression growing serious. If we do this, if we build something public and permanent, I can't go back to hiding. There will be visibility, accountability, expectations I can't control. Elena nodded understanding. Are you ready for that? Riley was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications of stepping permanently out of the shadows she'd inhabited for 12 years. Then she thought about the faces of people she'd helped quietly over the years, about the problems she could address more effectively with resources and support, about the possibility of training others to continue the work even if something happened to her. I think Samantha would want me to try, she said finally. Elena's smile was radiant with approval and anticipation. I think she'd be proud of the woman you've become and excited about the difference you're about to make. Riley picked up her phone, scrolling through the messages she'd been ignoring all morning. Then she started typing responses, accepting Vincent's invitation to meet, agreeing to Elena's suggestions about the warehouse space, beginning the process of transforming possibility into reality. For the first time in 12 years, Riley Carpenter was choosing visibility over safety, community over isolation, service over self-protection. The woman who had walked away from everything rather than compromise her principles was about to discover whether those same principles could guide her in building something new, something that honored both her past sacrifices and her future potential. 3 weeks later, Riley stood in the center of what would soon become Sanctuary Defense Training Center, watching Vincent measure wall space while Tank swept construction debris from the concrete floor. The warehouse Elena had mentioned was perfect for their needs. High ceilings, excellent natural light, and enough space to create distinct training areas without feeling cramped or institutional. Tommy arrived carrying coffee for everyone, his enthusiasm for the project evident in his willingness to handle even mundane logistics. Behind him came Bryce, hauling equipment they'd purchased from a gym that was closing downtown. The easy camaraderie that had developed among the group still surprised Riley, given how their relationships had begun. The electrical contractor says he can have the new lighting installed by Friday, Vincent reported, consulting the tablet where he'd been tracking renovation progress. And the flooring company confirmed they can start on the mats and padding early next week. Riley nodded, still amazed by how quickly their abstract plans had become concrete reality. Elena's connections in the Portland business community had accelerated every aspect of the process, from permits to contractors to equipment suppliers. More importantly, everyone involved seemed to understand they were building something unprecedented. What's the latest word from the women's shelter? Elena asked, joining them from the office space they'd carved out in the warehouse's corner. Riley pulled out her phone, scrolling to the message she'd received that morning. Director Martinez wants to schedule a meeting for next week. She's identified 8 residents who've expressed interest in the pilot program, but she wants to discuss our approach in detail before committing. That's smart, Bryce observed, testing the stability of a heavy bag mount they'd installed the previous day. She's protecting people who've already been hurt. She needs to be sure we understand what we're dealing with. The comment showed how much Bryce had grown in his understanding of their mission. 3 weeks ago, he might have been impatient with such careful vetting. Now he recognized that trauma survivors required entirely different training approaches than competitive fighters. Tank looked up from his sweeping, his expression thoughtful. I've been thinking about what Director Martinez said during our phone call, about how traditional self-defense classes sometimes make things worse for domestic violence survivors. Riley had been impressed by Tank's evolution since their confrontation at Iron Forge. His natural leadership abilities remained, but they were now guided by empathy and genuine concern for student welfare rather than ego and dominance. The problem is that most self-defense training assumes students start from a baseline of confidence and assertiveness, Riley explained. But trauma survivors often need to rebuild those qualities as part of learning protective skills. Elena nodded from where she was organizing curriculum materials on a folding table. Traditional classes also tend to focus on worst-case scenarios, on what to do when you're already being attacked. But for domestic violence survivors, the more important skills are often about recognizing danger early and extracting themselves from potentially harmful situations. Tommy paused in his equipment arranging, clearly processing new concepts. So we're not just teaching them how to fight back. We're teaching them how to avoid having to fight at all. Exactly, Riley confirmed. And when fighting becomes necessary, we're teaching them how to create opportunities to escape rather than how to dominate an opponent. The distinction was crucial to their entire philosophy. Unlike traditional martial arts or even military combat training, sanctuary defense was built around the principle that the best outcome of any violent encounter was rapid disengagement and successful escape. Vincent finished his measurements and joined the group discussion. I've been reading the materials you gave us about trauma-informed training approaches. The emphasis on student choice and control makes a lot of sense. Riley smiled, pleased that Vincent was engaging seriously with the psychological aspects of their work. His military background meant he understood discipline and structure, but learning to balance those qualities with sensitivity to student trauma had required significant mental adjustment. Every decision we make, from how we structure classes to how we demonstrate techniques, needs to reinforce the message that students have agency and control, Riley said. For someone who's escaped an abusive relationship, that sense of personal power is often more important than any specific physical technique. Bryce had finished testing equipment and now leaned against a support pillar, his expression unusually serious. Can I ask you guys something? About why we're really doing this? The question surprised everyone, partly because Bryce rarely initiated philosophical discussions, and partly because his tone suggested genuine uncertainty rather than casual curiosity. What do you mean? Elena asked gently. Bryce was quiet for a moment, clearly struggling to articulate something important. I mean, we all have our own lives, our own problems, our own goals. Tank's still training for professional fights. Tommy's trying to make the Olympic team. Vincent's got a gym to run. He looked around at each of them. And Riley could probably make a lot more money doing private security or consulting work. So why are we all here, spending our time and energy on something that's not going to make us rich or famous? The question hung in the air, challenging each of them to examine their motivations for committing to a project that offered more responsibility than reward. Tank was the first to respond, his voice carrying none of its former bravado but all of its conviction. Because 3 weeks ago, I learned that everything I thought I knew about strength was wrong. And if I was that wrong about something so fundamental, maybe I need to spend some time learning what real strength actually looks like. He gestured toward Riley with respect that would have been unimaginable a month earlier. Working with Riley, learning from her, helping build something that protects people instead of just entertaining them, that feels like actual growth instead of just getting better at something I already knew how to do. Tommy nodded enthusiastically. For me, it's about finding purpose beyond personal achievement. I've spent my whole life trying to be the best fighter I could be, but I never really thought about why that mattered or who it helped. He paused, organizing his thoughts. This project, training people who genuinely need protection, that gives meaning to all the skills I've developed. It makes them useful for something bigger than just winning medals or getting sponsorship deals. Vincent's response was more measured but equally thoughtful. I've been running Iron Forge for over 20 years, and I've seen thousands of people come through those doors. Most of them were looking for something they never found, some sense of purpose or confidence or community. He looked around the warehouse space they were transforming. What we're building here addresses the things people are actually looking for when they walk into a gym. Not just physical skills, but psychological strength, moral clarity, the sense that they're part of something meaningful. Elena had been listening quietly, But now she stepped forward with the authority of someone who'd spent decades in the fighting world. I've trained champions, coached world-class athletes, built successful businesses in the martial arts industry. But nothing I've ever done felt as important as what we're attempting here. Her voice carried passionate conviction. We're not just teaching people how to defend themselves. We're showing them that they have value worth defending, that they deserve safety and respect, that they can trust their own judgment about danger and protection. All eyes turned to Riley, waiting for her perspective on Bryce's question. She looked around at the faces of people who'd become partners in something unprecedented. People who'd committed themselves to a vision that challenged conventional wisdom about fighting, strength, and service. 6 months ago, I was convinced that the best thing I could do with my training and experience was to use it as quietly as possible, help one person at a time, and avoid creating situations where my past might complicate other people's lives. She said slowly. Riley walked to the large windows that faced the street, looking out at the neighborhood they'd chosen for their work. But watching all of you grow and change over the past 3 weeks, seeing how the ideas we're developing could help people I'll never meet, that's reminded me why I wanted to serve others in the first place. She turned back to face the group. This isn't about me using my skills anymore. It's about multiplying the impact of those skills by helping other people develop their own capabilities and judgment. Bryce nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with the responses he'd received. I guess what I'm really asking is whether we're ready for the responsibility this is going to create. Because if we do this right, if we build something that actually helps people, there's going to be no going back to the way things were before. The observation was both accurate and sobering. Once sanctuary defense became operational, once they started training trauma survivors and other vulnerable populations, they would be accountable not just for their students' technical development, but for their psychological well-being and personal safety. That's exactly why we're taking our time with the pilot program, Elena said. We need to understand not just what works, but what our responsibilities are and how to fulfill them properly. Riley appreciated Elena's caution, but she also recognized that over-preparation could become a form of avoidance. At some point, we have to trust our training, our judgment, and our commitment to doing right by the people who need our help. Tank had resumed his cleaning work, but he looked up at Riley's comment. How do we know when we're ready? I mean, what's the standard for knowing we won't accidentally make things worse for people who are already struggling? The question demonstrated how seriously Tank was taking their responsibilities, but it also highlighted one of their central challenges. Unlike traditional self-defense instruction, trauma-informed training required constant attention to psychological safety alongside physical skill development. We start with people who specifically request our help, Riley said. People like the residents at the women's shelter who've already decided they want to develop protective skills. That way we're responding to expressed needs rather than imposing our solutions on people who haven't asked for help. Elena pulled out the training protocols they'd been developing, spreading them across the folding table. And we build evaluation and feedback mechanisms into every aspect of the program. Students help us understand what's working, what's not, and what adjustments we need to make. Tommy joined them at the table, studying the detailed curriculum they'd created. This is a lot more complicated than regular martial arts instruction. Because the stakes are higher, Vincent observed. Regular martial arts students usually want to learn techniques for sport or general fitness. Our students will be learning skills they might need to save their lives or protect their families. Bryce pushed away from the pillar, moving closer to examine their planning materials. What happens if someone gets hurt during training? Not just physically, but psychologically. What if our instruction triggers trauma responses or makes someone feel worse about their situation? Riley had been wrestling with exactly this concern, drawing on her military experience with high stress, training while trying to adapt those methods for civilian trauma survivors. That's why we're requiring mental health support as part of the Program. Director Martinez confirmed that the shelter provides ongoing counseling for residents, and we're building coordination with those services into our training approach. Elena nodded approvingly. Students will have professional support for processing whatever emotions or memories come up during training. We're not trying to be therapists, but we are creating space for therapeutic processing of the experience. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Director Martinez herself, along with two women Riley didn't recognize. Elena had scheduled the meeting for this afternoon, but Riley hadn't expected the director to bring potential students for their first site visit. "I hope you don't mind the company," Director Martinez said, gesturing to her companions. Sarah and Maria expressed such strong interest in the program that I thought they should see the space and meet the instructors before making their final decision. Riley looked quickly around the warehouse, suddenly seeing it through the eyes of trauma survivors rather than experienced fighters. The space was large and open, which could feel either empowering or overwhelming, depending on someone's psychological state. Sarah, a woman in her early 30s with careful eyes and defensive posture, spoke first. "It's bigger than I expected. Most self-defense classes I've looked into were held in small studios or community center rooms. We wanted space for different types of training," Riley explained, moving slowly and keeping her voice calm and non-threatening. "Some people learn better in open areas where they can see all the exits and feel like they have room to move. Others prefer smaller, more contained spaces." Maria, slightly older and carrying herself with more apparent confidence, walked toward the windows Riley had been looking through earlier. "I like that it doesn't feel like a traditional gym. No mirrors everywhere, no intimidating equipment, no posters of muscular fighters staring down at you." Tank, who had been cleaning in the background, carefully set aside his broom and approached the group with none of his former swagger. "We specifically chose not to decorate with fighting imagery or competitive trophies. This space is about protection and empowerment, not about proving dominance or winning contests." Riley watched Sarah's reaction to Tank's presence, noting how she positioned herself to keep him in her peripheral vision while maintaining distance. Her response was textbook trauma survivor behavior, and Riley felt a familiar surge of protective anger toward whoever had taught Sarah to monitor large men so carefully. "Would you like to see how we've organized the different training areas?" Elena offered, clearly recognizing the need to keep the conversation focused on student comfort and program structure. Director Martinez nodded approvingly as Elena led them through the space, explaining their rationale for equipment placement, lighting choices, and sight lines. Everything had been designed with trauma-informed principles in mind, prioritizing student safety and psychological comfort over efficiency or traditional martial arts aesthetics. "What kind of techniques will you be teaching?" Sarah asked, her voice showing both interest and apprehension. Riley moved closer, but not so close as to make Sarah uncomfortable. "We start with situational awareness and threat recognition. Learning to trust your instincts about people and situations, understanding how to position yourself safely in public spaces, developing confidence in your ability to read and respond to potential danger." She gestured toward the open training area. "Physical techniques come later, and they're always taught in the context of creating opportunities to escape rather than engaging in prolonged conflict." Maria had been examining the equipment they'd installed, running her hand along a heavy bag that was mounted lower than traditional boxing bags. "This is different from what I've seen in other gyms. Traditional heavy bags are designed for tall, strong fighters throwing punches at head level," Bryce explained, joining the conversation with obvious respect for the women's concerns. "We've set up equipment that works for different body types and allows people to practice techniques they might actually use in real situations." Tommy appeared at Riley's shoulder, carrying a folder of materials they'd prepared for perspective. "Students, we've also got written materials that explain our philosophy and methods, so you can review everything at your own pace and decide what feels right for you. Director Martinez accepted the folder, but her attention remained focused on observing how her residents were responding to the space and the instructors. Riley could see her making mental notes about body language, comfort levels, and interpersonal dynamics. "What's your background in working with trauma survivors?" Director Martinez asked Riley directly. "I know Elena mentioned military training, but domestic violence creates very specific psychological challenges." Riley appreciated the direct question, recognizing it as appropriate professional caution rather than personal suspicion. "My military experience included training in recognizing and responding to various forms of psychological trauma. But you're absolutely right that domestic violence creates unique challenges." She looked at Sarah and Maria, addressing them directly rather than talking about them to the director. "That's why we've spent the past 3 weeks studying trauma-informed training approaches and consulting with mental health professionals who work specifically with domestic violence survivors." Elena stepped forward to add her perspective. "We've also built ongoing consultation into our program structure. We're not assuming we know everything about your experiences or needs. We're planning to learn and adjust as we work together." Sarah's posture had relaxed slightly during the conversation, and she made eye contact with Riley for the first time. "Most self-defense instructors I've talked to want to know details about what happened to me, like they need to understand my specific situation before they can teach me anything useful." Riley felt a flash of anger at whoever had handled previous inquiries so insensitively. "Your personal history is yours to share or not share as you choose. Our training is designed to help you develop skills and confidence regardless of your specific experiences." Maria had wandered back toward the windows, but she turned to rejoin the conversation. "What if we discover during training that we're not ready for this? What if it brings up too much stuff or feels too overwhelming?" Vincent answered before Riley could respond. "Then you stop, take whatever time you need, and decide whether you want to try again later or pursue other options. This is about empowering you, not pushing you through something that doesn't feel right." The response seemed to satisfy both women, and Riley saw Director Martinez nod approvingly at Vincent's sensitivity to student agency and choice. "When would the pilot program start?" Director Martinez asked, consulting her own calendar. Elena looked at Riley, who mentally reviewed their preparation timeline. "We're hoping to begin in 2 weeks, assuming we can finalize enrollment and complete our final equipment installation." "And how long would the program run?" Sarah asked. "The pilot program is designed as 6 weeks of twice-weekly sessions," Riley explained. "But the actual structure would depend on what works best for participating students. If people need more time or different scheduling, we adjust accordingly." Maria had been quiet for several minutes, but now she stepped closer to the group. "I have to ask, and I hope this doesn't sound rude, but what do you all get out of this? I mean, why are you spending your time and money on something like this?" The question was fair and important, and Riley appreciated Maria's directness in asking it. Students deserve to understand instructor motivations, especially when those students belong to populations that had been exploited or taken advantage of in the past. Tank answered first, his voice carrying quiet conviction. 3 weeks ago, I learned that I'd been confusing strength with aggression, power with dominance. Working on this project is helping me understand what real strength looks like and how to use whatever abilities I have in service of protecting people rather than intimidating them. Tommy nodded agreement. For me, it's about finding purpose beyond personal achievement. All the training and skills I've developed over the years, this gives them meaning beyond just winning competitions or impressing other fighters. Vincent's response was characteristically thoughtful. I've spent 20 years helping people develop physical skills, but I've never worked on something that addressed the psychological and emotional aspects of feeling safe in the world. This feels like the most important thing I've ever been involved In. Elena smiled at her colleagues' responses before adding her own perspective. I've trained world-class fighters and successful martial artists, but nothing I've done has felt as meaningful as helping people develop the confidence and skills they need to protect themselves and live without fear. All eyes turned to Riley, waiting for her explanation of motivations that everyone present understood were complex and deeply personal. 12 years ago, I made choices that cost me my career, my identity, and ultimately the person I loved most in the world, Riley said. Slowly. For a long time, I thought the lesson was to avoid getting involved in other people's problems, to use my skills quietly and individually without building relationships or taking on responsibilities. She looked around at the space they'd created together, then at the faces of people who'd become partners in something unprecedented. But working with all of you, planning this program, imagining how we might help people like yourselves develop confidence and protective skills, that's reminded me why I wanted to serve others in the first place. Riley's voice grew stronger as she continued. This isn't about me finding redemption or proving something about my past choices. This is about using everything I've learned, both from my training and from my mistakes, to help other people navigate dangerous situations with more wisdom and capability than I had when I was facing my own challenges. The honesty in Riley's response seemed to resonate with both Sarah and Maria, who exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to trust the motivations and competence of the instruction team. Director Martinez had been observing the entire interaction with professional attention, and now she stepped forward with apparent decision. I'd like to schedule individual meetings with each of you before we finalize enrollment. Sarah and Maria, you should take time to discuss this privately and decide whether you're ready to commit to the pilot program. She looked around the warehouse space one more time. But I'll say this, I've been working with domestic violence survivors for 15 years. And I've never seen a self-defense program that was designed with this level of attention to trauma-informed principles and student psychological safety. Riley felt a surge of pride in what they'd built together, but also a renewed awareness of the responsibility they were accepting. Director Martinez, we appreciate your confidence, but we also want you to know that we're committed to ongoing learning and adjustment. If we discover we need to change our approach or methods, we'll do that immediately. Elena nodded agreement. This is as much a learning experience for us as it will be for the students. We're prepared to adapt based on what we discover about effective trauma-informed training. Sarah, who had been quiet during the final exchanges, suddenly spoke up. Can I ask one more question? Riley nodded encouragingly. What happens after the pilot program ends? I mean, if this works, if we develop skills and confidence, what kind of ongoing support will be available? The question revealed both hope and fear, the desire for continued growth balanced against concern about being abandoned once the formal program concluded. Riley looked at Elena, then at the rest of their team, seeing the same commitment in their faces that she felt in her own heart. Sarah, what we're building here isn't just a 6-week program. It's the beginning of a community, a network of people, committed to supporting each other's safety and empowerment. Elena stepped forward to elaborate. The pilot program is just our starting point. If it's successful, we'll expand to serve more people, develop advanced training options, and create ongoing support systems for anyone who's been through our programs. Tommy added his own perspective. And even after formal training ends, you'll always be part of what we're building here. We want graduates to help train new students, to share their experiences and insights, to be part of creating something that serves people long beyond our individual involvement. The vision they were articulating was ambitious and unprecedented, but it felt both achievable and necessary to everyone present. Riley could see Sarah and Maria beginning to imagine themselves not just as students, but as future contributors to something larger than their individual healing and development. Director Martinez checked her watch, clearly needing to return to her other responsibilities. I think we have everything we need to move forward with the next steps. Sarah, Maria, you'll let me know your decision by early next week?" Both women nodded, and Riley could see that they were genuinely considering participation, rather than simply being polite about an opportunity they had no intention of pursuing. As the visitors prepared to leave, Maria approached Riley directly. "Thank you for taking the time to explain everything so thoroughly. Most places I've inquired about training seem more interested in signing me up than in making sure I understand what I'm getting into." Riley felt a familiar surge of protective anger at the thought of vulnerable people being taken advantage of by predatory businesses, but she kept her voice calm and supportive. "Maria, the most important thing is that you make the decision that feels right for you. Whether that's our program or something else entirely, trust your instincts about what you need." After the visitors left, the team stood in their warehouse space, processing the significance of what had just occurred. They were no longer planning an abstract program or designing theoretical curricula. They were preparing to work with real people who had survived real trauma and who were trusting them with their safety and psychological well-being. "That felt important," Tommy said finally, breaking the contemplative silence. Riley nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The transition from preparation to actual service created both excitement and sobering awareness of the responsibilities they were accepting. "It felt like the beginning of something that could matter," Tank agreed. "Not just for Sarah and Maria, but for all the people we might eventually be able to help." Elena began collecting the materials they'd shared with their visitors, but her expression showed satisfaction with how the meeting had developed. "They're going to say yes, both of them." I could see it in their body language and questions. Riley hoped Elena was right, but she also knew that trauma survivors needed to make decisions in their own time and according to their own judgment. Whether they participate or not, today proved that we're building something that addresses real needs in ways that feel safe and appropriate to the people who need it most. Vincent was already back to his measurements and planning, but he looked up to add his perspective. What impressed me was how they asked exactly the right questions. They wanted to understand our motivations, our qualifications, our long-term vision. Those are people who've learned to protect themselves by being careful about who they trust. Bryce had been uncharacteristically quiet during and after the visit, but now he stepped forward with an expression of determined resolve. "I need to be better at this. Better at understanding trauma. Better at creating safety for people who've been hurt. Better at using my knowledge in service of protection, rather than just technical excellence." Riley recognized the commitment in Bryce's voice, the same transformation that had occurred in Tank but adapted to Bryce's particular personality and experience. That awareness is the first step toward becoming the kind of instructor people like Sarah and Maria need. As they resumed their work preparing the space, Riley reflected on how much had changed since her confrontation with Tank at Iron Forge just 3 weeks earlier. She'd gone from hiding her abilities and avoiding meaningful connections to building something that could serve vulnerable people throughout Portland and potentially far beyond. The woman who had spent 12 years in exile was discovering that coming out of hiding didn't have to mean returning to the institutional constraints and moral compromises that had made military service unsustainable. Sometimes the most powerful choice was creating something entirely new, something that honored both technical excellence and human dignity. Tomorrow they would finalize equipment installation and complete their instructor training protocols. Next week, they would begin working with their first students, people who had survived terrible experiences and were now ready to develop their own capabilities for protection and empowerment. Riley Carpenter was no longer running from her past or hiding from her potential. She was building a future that made use of everything she'd learned, everything she'd sacrificed, and everything she'd become in the years since choosing conscience. Overconvenience had cost her everything she thought mattered. The pilot program would be just the beginning. 6 months after the pilot program began, Riley stood at the edge of the training floor watching Maria, demonstrate basic situational awareness techniques to a new group of students. The transformation in Maria's confidence and presence was remarkable. But what struck Riley most was how naturally she'd embraced the role of mentor and teacher. "Remember to trust what your body is telling you," Maria was saying to a young woman who'd recently escaped an abusive marriage. "If something feels wrong about a person or situation, that feeling is information, not paranoia." The student nodded. Practicing the scanning technique Maria had demonstrated, learning to assess her environment without appearing anxious or suspicious. It was exactly the kind of practical skill that traditional self-defense classes rarely addressed, but that trauma survivors desperately needed. Sarah approached Riley from the other side of the training floor, where she'd been working with Tommy on advanced de-escalation strategies. Her entire demeanor had changed over the months, evolving from hyper-vigilant defensiveness to calm alertness. More importantly, she discovered a talent for helping other survivors navigate the psychological challenges of rebuilding personal agency. "The new intake group is responding well," Sarah reported quietly. 3 of them have specifically asked about becoming peer mentors after they complete the basic program. Riley smiled, unsurprised by the news. One of their most significant discoveries was that trauma survivors often became exceptional instructors, possessing both technical competence and emotional understanding that made them uniquely effective with similar populations. The success of Sanctuary Defense had exceeded everyone's expectations. What had begun as a 6-week pilot program for 8 women had evolved into a comprehensive training center serving over 60 active students, with a waiting list that stretched for months. More importantly, they developed a model that was being replicated in 3 other cities, with inquiries coming from organizations across the country. Elena emerged from the office area, carrying enrollment paperwork and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose vision had become sustainable reality. "The Portland Police Bureau just approved our proposal for training their domestic violence response officers. We'll be teaching them trauma-informed de-escalation techniques starting next month." The partnership with law enforcement had been one of their most challenging developments, requiring careful negotiation to maintain their principles while working within institutional constraints. But Riley had eventually concluded that training police officers to better serve trauma survivors was consistent with their mission of expanding protective capabilities throughout the community. Tank finished his session with a group of teenagers from local high schools, young people who were learning conflict resolution and personal safety skills as alternatives to the gang involvement that threatened many of their neighborhoods. His evolution from aggressive fighter to thoughtful mentor had been one of the program's most striking success stories. Coach Martinez wants to schedule a follow-up meeting about expanding the school district program, Tank reported, joining Riley and Sarah. "Apparently word is spreading about our approach, and other schools are requesting similar training for their students." Riley nodded, pleased but also slightly overwhelmed by the constant growth and demand for their services. Success created its own challenges, particularly when it came to maintaining quality and staying true to their founding principles while serving ever larger populations. Vincent appeared from the equipment storage area where he'd been organizing materials for their evening session with healthcare workers. The program had expanded to serve various professional populations who needed conflict management skills, from emergency room nurses to social workers to teachers in challenging environments. Dr. Peterson from the trauma center called, Vincent reported. She wants to discuss developing specialized training for her staff who work with assault victims. Apparently, our work with the police department has generated interest throughout the medical community. The interconnected nature of Portland's social service community meant that success in one area often led to opportunities in others. Riley had learned to balance ambition with caution, ensuring they could serve new populations effectively rather than simply accepting every request that came their way. Bryce was working in the corner with a group of military veterans, helping them adapt their existing combat training to civilian protection scenarios. Many veterans struggled with the transition from military to civilian contexts, and Bryce's combination of technical expertise and personal growth had made him exceptionally effective with this population. The VA administrator wants to expand our veteran program statewide, Bryce announced, overhearing the conversation. They're offering significant funding, but they want us to train a cohort of veteran instructors who could replicate our methods at other facilities. Riley felt the familiar tension between growth opportunities and their ability to maintain program integrity. Every expansion required careful attention to instructor training, quality control, and adherence to their trauma-informed principles. "We need to talk about scaling challenges," Elena said, clearly reading Riley's concerns. "We're getting more requests than we can handle directly, but we can't compromise our standards just to serve larger numbers." Riley gathered her team in the office area, where they developed the habit of holding brief planning sessions at the end of each training day. The informal meetings had become essential for maintaining communication as their operations grew more complex. "The fundamental question is whether we prioritize depth or breadth," Riley said, settling into one of the chairs they'd arranged in a circle. "We can serve more people by expanding rapidly, or we can serve people better by growing more slowly and maintaining direct oversight of quality." Tommy, who had been cleaning equipment in the background, joined the conversation. "What if those aren't mutually exclusive choices? What if we focus on training exceptional instructors who can maintain our standards while working independently?" Elena's eyes lit up with possibility. "A certification program. We could develop rigorous training standards and ongoing supervision. Protocols that would allow qualified instructors to operate sanctuary defense programs in other locations." The idea had appeal, but Riley remained cautious about maintaining program integrity across multiple sites and instructors. It would require extensive documentation of our methods, regular evaluation of certified instructors, and probably ongoing consultation to handle complex cases. Tank leaned forward, his expression showing the analytical thinking that had replaced his earlier impulsiveness. "But it would also mean helping people in communities that don't have access to anything, like what we've built here. That seems consistent with our mission." Sarah, who had been quiet during the planning discussion, suddenly spoke up. "What about the students who've been through our programs? Some of them have developed exceptional skills and understanding. Why not train them to become certified instructors?" The suggestion surprised Riley, but as she considered it, the logic became compelling. Graduate students understood both the techniques and the psychological journey of trauma recovery. They possessed credibility with new students and commitment to the program's values that would be difficult to replicate in external instructors. "That's brilliant," Vincent said immediately. "People like Maria and some of our other graduates already function as informal mentors. Formalizing that role and providing additional training could create exactly the kind of instructors we'd need for expansion." Riley looked around at the faces of people who'd become partners in something none of them could have imagined when they first met at Iron Forge Boxing Gym. "So we'd be creating a pathway for trauma survivors to become empowerment instructors, using their own healing journey as the foundation for helping others." Elena nodded enthusiastically. "And we'd be building sustainability into the program by creating career opportunities for people who might otherwise struggle to find work that accommodates their experiences and needs." The vision was taking shape rapidly, transforming from abstract possibility into concrete planning. Riley could see how their local success might become a model for serving vulnerable populations nationally, all while maintaining the personal attention and trauma-informed principles that made their approach effective. "There's something else we should consider," Bryce said thoughtfully. "If we're going to train instructors who work with trauma survivors, we need to address instructor self-care and secondary trauma prevention. The observation demonstrated how much Bryce had grown in his understanding of psychological complexity. Working with trauma survivors could be emotionally challenging, even for experienced instructors, and proper support systems were essential for maintaining both instructor well-being and program quality. Riley appreciated Bryce's insight, recognizing it as evidence of the maturity and wisdom that had developed throughout their team. That's exactly the kind of consideration that will distinguish our certification program from generic instructor training. Tommy had been taking notes during the conversation, and now he looked up with additional ideas. What about creating different levels of certification? Basic instructors who can teach fundamental skills, advanced instructors who can handle complex trauma cases, master instructors who can train other instructors. The suggestion added structure to their emerging vision, creating clear pathways for professional development, while ensuring appropriate matching between instructor capabilities and student needs. Elena was already sketching organizational charts and training progressions. We could start with a pilot certification program using our most advanced local graduates, then expand based on what we learn about effective instructor development. Riley stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the neighborhood they'd chosen for their work. The area had changed significantly since they'd opened, with other social service organizations relocating nearby and local businesses adapting to serve the populations their programs attracted. If we do this, if we commit to building something national in scope, we need to understand that it will change everything about our lives and our work, she said slowly. We'll have responsibilities and visibility that we can't take back if we discover we're not ready for them. Tank joined her at the window, his expression serious but determined. 6 months ago, I was a mediocre professional fighter whose biggest accomplishment was intimidating people smaller than me. Now I'm helping teenagers develop alternatives to violence and training police officers to better serve trauma survivors. He looked at Riley with respect that had replaced his earlier antagonism. If you hadn't been willing to reveal who you really were, if you hadn't been willing to take risks for the sake of helping others, none of us would have discovered what we were capable of. Sarah approached from the other side, her transformation from fearful survivor to confident mentor evident in every aspect of her bearing. Riley, you gave me back my sense of personal power, my ability to trust my own judgment, my confidence. But I could protect myself and help others do the same. She gestured toward the training floor where Maria was still working with new students. Now Maria and I and dozens of other graduates are doing the same thing for people who need exactly what we needed 6 months ago. Elena closed her planning notebook and joined them at the window. What we've built here works. It transforms trauma survivors into empowered protectors, turns former bullies into thoughtful mentors, creates community connections that serve people long after formal training ends. Vincent nodded agreement from his position near the office desk. And we've proven that it can be systematized and taught to others without losing its essential character or effectiveness. Riley looked around at her partners, seeing in their faces the same commitment and vision that had sustained them through the challenges of building something unprecedented. Then we're really going to do this. We're going to try to create a national network of trauma-informed defense training programs. Bryce grinned, showing enthusiasm that would have been unimaginable during their early conversations. What if we focus on training exceptional instructors who can maintain our standards while working independently? Elena's eyes lit up with possibility. A certification program. We could develop rigorous training standards and ongoing supervision. Protocols that would allow qualified instructors to operate sanctuary defense programs in other locations. The idea had appeal, but Riley remained cautious about maintaining program integrity across multiple sites and instructors. It would require extensive documentation of our methods, regular evaluation of certified instructors, and probably ongoing consultation to handle complex cases. Tank leaned forward, his expression showing the analytical thinking that had replaced his earlier impulsiveness. But it would also mean helping people in communities that don't have access to anything, like what we've built here. That seems consistent with our mission. Sarah, who had been quiet during the planning discussion, suddenly spoke up. What about the students who've been through our programs? Some of them have developed exceptional skills and understanding. Why not train them to become certified instructors? The suggestion surprised Riley, but as she considered it, the logic became compelling. Graduate students understood both the techniques and the psychological journey of trauma recovery. They possessed credibility with new students and commitment to the program's values that would be difficult to replicate in external instructors. That's brilliant, Vincent said immediately. People like Maria and some of our other graduates already function as informal mentors. Formalizing that role and providing additional training could create exactly the kind of instructors we'd need for expansion. Riley looked around at the faces of people who'd become partners in something none of them could have imagined when they first met at Iron Forge Boxing Gym. So we'd be creating a pathway for trauma survivors to become empowerment instructors, using their own healing journey as the foundation for helping others. Elena nodded enthusiastically. And we'd be building sustainability into the program by creating career opportunities for people who might otherwise struggle to find work that accommodates their experiences and needs. The vision was taking shape rapidly, transforming from abstract possibility into concrete planning. Riley could see how their local success might become a model for serving vulnerable populations nationally, all while maintaining the personal attention and trauma-informed principles that made their approach effective. There's something else we should consider, Bryce said thoughtfully. If we're going to train instructors who work with trauma survivors, we need to address instructor self-care and secondary trauma prevention. The observation demonstrated how much Bryce had grown in his understanding of psychological complexity. Working with trauma survivors could be emotionally challenging, even for experienced instructors, and proper support systems were essential for maintaining both instructor well-being and program quality. Riley appreciated Bryce's insight, recognizing it as evidence of the maturity and wisdom that had developed throughout their team. That's exactly the kind of consideration that will distinguish our certification program from generic instructor training. Tommy had been taking notes during the conversation, and now he looked up with additional ideas. What about creating different levels of certification? Basic instructors who can teach fundamental skills, advanced instructors who can handle complex trauma cases, master instructors who can train other instructors. The suggestion added structure to their emerging vision, creating clear pathways for professional development, while ensuring appropriate matching between instructor capabilities and student needs. Elena was already sketching organizational charts and training progressions. We could start with a pilot certification program using our most advanced local graduates, then expand based on what we learn about effective instructor development. Riley stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the neighborhood they'd chosen for their work. The area had changed significantly since they'd opened, with other social service organizations relocating nearby and local businesses adapting to serve the populations their programs attracted. If we do this, if we commit to building something national in scope, we need to understand that it will change everything about our lives and our work, she said slowly. We'll have responsibilities and visibility that we can't take back if we discover we're not ready for them. Tank joined her at the window, his expression serious but determined. 6 months ago, I was a mediocre professional fighter whose biggest accomplishment was intimidating people smaller than me. Now I'm helping teenagers develop alternatives to violence and training police officers to better serve trauma survivors. He looked at Riley with respect that had replaced his earlier antagonism. If you hadn't been willing to reveal who you really were, if you hadn't been willing to take risks for the sake of helping others, none of us would have discovered what we were capable of. Sarah approached from the other side, her transformation from fearful survivor to confident mentor evident in every aspect of her bearing. "Riley, you gave me back my sense of personal power, my ability to trust my own judgment, my confidence. But I could protect myself and help others do the same." She gestured toward the training floor where Maria was still working with new students. "Now Maria and I and dozens of other graduates are doing the same thing for people who need exactly what we needed 6 months ago." Elena closed her planning notebook and joined them at the window. "What we've built here works. It transforms trauma survivors into empowered protectors, turns former bullies into thoughtful mentors, creates community connections that serve people long after formal training ends." Vincent nodded agreement from his position near the office desk. "And we've proven that it can be systematized and taught to others without losing its essential character or effectiveness." Riley looked around at her partners, seeing in their faces the same commitment and vision that had sustained them through the challenges of building something unprecedented. "Then we're really going to do this. We're going to try to create a national network of trauma-informed defense training programs." Bryce grinned, showing enthusiasm that would have been unimaginable during their early conversations. "We're going to try to change how this country thinks about strength, protection, and service to vulnerable populations." Tommy's excitement was infectious as he began outlining implementation timelines and resource requirements. "We'll need to develop comprehensive training materials, create evaluation protocols, establish ongoing supervision systems." Elena was already mentally organizing the logistics of expansion. "And we'll need to identify funding sources, establish legal structures for multi-state operations, develop quality assurance mechanisms." The conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from instructor recruitment to curriculum standardization to program evaluation metrics. By the time they finished planning, Riley realized they'd committed themselves to an undertaking that would define the rest of their professional lives. As the team prepared to leave for the evening, Riley remained in the office area, looking out at the training floor where so many people had discovered capabilities they never knew they possessed. The space was quiet now, but tomorrow it would again be filled with the sounds of people learning to trust their instincts, developing their skills, and building the confidence they needed to navigate a dangerous world. Maria appeared in the doorway, having finished her work with the new student group. "Riley, can I ask you something?" Riley nodded, curious about what had prompted Maria to seek private conversation. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if you'd never walked into Iron Forge that day? If you'd never had that confrontation with Tank?" The question touched on something Riley had been contemplating increasingly as their success created new possibilities and responsibilities. "I think about it sometimes. I'd probably still be helping people quietly, one at a time, trying to stay invisible and avoid complications." Maria smiled, her expression showing gratitude mixed with something approaching awe. "But then none of us would have discovered what we were capable of. Sarah wouldn't have learned to trust herself again. Tank wouldn't have found purpose beyond just winning fights. I wouldn't have learned that surviving trauma could become the foundation for helping others heal." Riley understood what Maria was really asking, the deeper question about choices and consequences that everyone who'd been transformed by their experience carried. "Maria, do you think it was worth it? All the risk, all the vulnerability, all the ways that stepping out of hiding changed everything." Maria was quiet for a moment, considering her response carefully. 6 months ago, I was afraid of my own shadow, convinced I'd never feel safe or strong again. Tonight I taught someone else that her instincts were trustworthy, that she had the right to take up space in the world, that she could learn to protect herself and others. She looked around the training floor where her own transformation had begun. "If you'd stayed hidden, if you'd never revealed who you really were, I'd still be that frightened person. Instead, I'm someone who helps other people discover their own strength." Riley felt tears threatening for the second time in 6 months, moved by the realization that her choice to step out of the shadows had created ripple effects she was still discovering. "Maria, you've become exactly the kind of person I hoped to serve when I first decided to use my training to help others." Maria's smile was radiant with confidence and purpose. "And you've become exactly the kind of teacher people like me needed. Someone who understood both the techniques and the healing, both the skills and the wisdom to use them properly." As Maria left for the evening, Riley remained alone in the quiet training center, reflecting on the journey that had brought her from exile to community, from hiding to leadership, from individual service to institutional change. The woman who had walked into Iron Forge boxing gym trying to remain invisible had discovered that sometimes the most powerful choice is the decision to be seen. Her confrontation with Tank had revealed not just her capabilities, but her character, not just her skills, but her values, not just her strength, but her wisdom about when and how to use it. Tomorrow they would begin developing their instructor certification program, taking the first steps toward creating something that could serve vulnerable people across the country. They would face new challenges, accept new responsibilities, and discover whether their local success could be scaled without losing its essential humanity. Riley Carpenter had spent 12 years learning that conscience sometimes demands sacrificing everything you think you want. Tonight she was discovering that following your conscience can also create everything you never knew you needed. The pilot program had become a movement, the training center had become a model, and the woman who once chose principles over career had built something that honored both service and integrity. She'd learned that real strength isn't about hiding your capabilities or avoiding difficult choices. It's about using your gifts in service of something larger than yourself, even when that service requires risking everything you've built to protect yourself. 6 months after flooring Tank in 3 seconds, Riley had discovered that the most important battles aren't won with perfect technique or devastating power. They're won with the courage to stand up for people who need protection, the wisdom to build something that serves others, and the faith that choosing conscience over convenience can create possibilities you never imagined. The desert of exile had become a garden of community, and Riley Carpenter was exactly where she belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.